And I think that we can go ahead and begin the session, if that's all right for you, Tembeka. First, I will do.
It's perfect for me.
Okay, great. First, I'm going to do a short introduction, and then just explain how the session will be run. Or rather, let me do it the other way around. So there's a very, very, very brief introduction because, of course, the majority of time, I'm so looking forward to hearing the paper that Tembeka and Ngcukaitobi will be presenting today. So the presentation will be about 45 minutes. And then thereafter, we will have a Q&A. So please have your pens poised and take some notes, gather your thoughts so that we can have a really engaged question and answer session after the paper has been delivered. Great. So Tembeka Ngcukaitobi is a lawyer and a writer. His intellectual interests are on frontier history, Black intellectual thought, land, constitutionalism, and property. He's the author of 2 books, and his most recent book is called Land Matters, South Africa's Failed Land Reforms and the Road Ahead. And I mean, I first came across his work in his first book, The Land is Ours, South Africa's First Black Lawyers and the Birth of Constitutionalism. And in that book, he examines the trajectory along which South Africa's current constitution was built on. And this necessarily means that it accounts for the experiences of South Africa's first Black lawyers who worked amidst violent colonial expansion typified by widespread land dispossession and forced labor here in South Africa. So as an anthropologist with a keen interest in locating the present as a direct inheritance of our history, I really appreciated the enormous archival digging that went into preparing what that book entailed. So in effect, what he examined in that seminal text ushered in an important analytical lens. And this lens is one that recalibrates normative historical narratives in order to surface repositories of knowledge that steer the conversation of history away from Western hegemonic moorings. And so for South Africa's embattled past, the question of land remains a moot point. And so today, Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi will be presenting a paper titled Cattle Looting and British Colonialism of South Africa, A Forgotten History, which promises to yield a hearty debate. So please make yourselves comfortable and take notes. I hope you are all just as excited as I am. I've been waiting for this for a very long time. So thank you so much for joining us today amidst your very busy schedule. And yes, please, welcome. The floor is yours, Tembeka.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. As an author of a book, you are always worried whether or not anyone other than yourself will be interested in what you have written. So it is always pleasing that you are invited to speak at an academic institution about some of the work that one has produced. So I am very pleased indeed to be here. As you have pointed out, the title of the paper, which is not entirely exactly the same as what appears in the book, but it is based on one of the chapters in the book. The title of the paper is Cattle Looting and British Colonialism in South Africa, A Forgotten History. When I grew up in the early 80s, my history textbooks at school included an explanation of how white people ended up with so many cattle and Black people with so few. The textbook that at the time we were prescribed to read, known as Timelines, told the story by an illustration. White people appeared with mirrors, bracelets. Black people were shown with cattle. The teacher would then explain to us the symbolism of the picture. What we were looking at were the commercial exchanges. Whites gave blacks gave whites cattle in exchange for a mirror, for a spoon, for a bracelet. When these exchanges are expanded on a vast scale, an exchange economy emerges, a social structure is created, and suddenly Black people's poverty is easy to explain. Yet during the breaks, we would tease each other as young children about how stupid our grandfathers must have been to exchange cattle for mirrors. Unbeknown to us, young minds, two things were happening in the classroom. The first was the construction of the past, of course, in the image of Europe. And the second was the indoctrination about the hierarchy of intellectual norms. These pictures in the textbooks confirmed that we Blacks were inferior and them, whites, were superior. This is what explained the social and political structures that we grew up under. Yet at home, with my grandmother, a new narrative was emerging. My grandmother never owned more than 7 adult cattle at any given time in her entire life. But her tales spoke of an era of great abundance, where her own grandfather owned hundreds of cattle. It was the laws that changed, she would protest to me, before refusing to give any further interviews on the subject. So it has largely been these contradictions between academic history, between school history, and social history that drove me to write Land Matters, which is my second book. One of the themes in Land Matters is cattle theft and how it contributed to the decline of Black societies. And so the title then of today's talk is Cattle Looting, and it is befitting that we do this at Stellenbosch University, of course, the first site of looting. The story starts with a shipwreck, as many stories do, and in 1647, the Dutch East India Company owned several ships. One of them was the Haarlem. It wrecked near Table Bay off the coast of what today is known as Cape Town. Its final destination was Batavia. Today we know this as Jakarta in Indonesia. And this was the site of the spice trade, which the Dutch East India Company controlled and made it an economically dominant force in Europe. Not only did it become a force in Europe, it also became a force globally. The company had become the government. Some of the crew from the Haarlem found passage on other ships and went back to Europe, but about half of them stayed behind and in the Cape for several months. They would encounter indigenous people, the Koikoi. These people would help them to look after the salvage cargo until help arrived. One of the people who came months after the shipwreck was a man known as Johan Antonison van Riebeeck. We know him as Jan van Riebeeck. He would stay in the Cape for some 3 weeks in 1648. In the following year, 1649, one of the crew members, Leendert Jannes of the Haarlem, would write to the company purporting to give a short exposition of the advantages to be derived by the company from a fort and the garden at the Cape of Good Hope. He sought to persuade the company to occupy the Cape permanently. This was his justification. The soil is very good in the valley, he said. Everything will grow there as well as any other part of the world, especially pumpkin, watermelon, cabbage, carrot, radish, turnip, onion, garlic, and all kinds of vegetables. He also noted that the company would benefit from the labor of the indigenous people, as they could be taught Dutch language. He also stated that some of their children may afterwards be employed as servants and educated in the Christian religion. This way, many souls would be brought to the Christian Reformed religion and to God. Three things, therefore, motivated the establishment of the fort. The first was the promise of free labor. The second was the promise of land. And the third, as we will talk about, was the promise of cattle. Janus had also witnessed how his own countrymen, the Dutch, interfaced with the indigenous people during the couple of months that they stayed with them. Colonial perceptions at the time had perceived native people as savages. But Janus disputed the notion of savagery. His own experience was that it was the Dutch who were savage. It was not the indigenous people that were brutal or cannibalistic. Often, when the native people retaliated, they were perceived as brutal, and yet they were retaliating to the brutality of colonial conquest. This is what he said. Natives came with all the friendliness to trade with us at the fort, which we had thrown up during our 5 months of stay, bringing cattle and sheep in numbers. It was these cattle and sheep that kept the stranded crew members of the Harlem Shipwreck alive. 2 of them, a carpenter and a corporal, had sought accommodation among the Koikoi, who received them and treated them with kindness, while they might have killed them if they were inclined to cannibalism. As such, Janus noted that the instances of the Dutch being killed by the Koikoi were undoubtedly acts of revenge. And these were acts of revenge when the cattle were seized, and not because these people are cannibals, he stated. So it is quite clear from the early observations of the Europeans who arrived at the Cape that they found a community that was willing to accommodate the Europeans. But their own treatment of that community was barbaric. Jans had proposed the establishment of the fort. The company, the Dutch East India Company, received this proposal with endorsement. Van Riebeeck was appointed to lead the expedition. Van Riebeeck himself, in June 1651, already foresaw what was about to happen. He would be critical of Jans. These are his words. Jans does not seem to have any fear of the natives, but I beg to state as my opinion that they are not to be trusted, being a brutal gang living without any conscience. These are Van Riebeeck's words. It was Van Riebeeck who was thereafter appointed to lead the Cape establishment of the fort. His own intention was not only political, it was also commercial. He saw the establishment of a Dutch fort at the Cape as part of the expansion of the commercial interests of the Dutch East India Company. So part of the attraction of the Cape was the prospect for international trade. It was premised on the idea that native people didn't have a prior claim to their own land. When Van Riebeeck and his crew arrived at the Cape on Saturday, the 6th of April, 1652, the local population had been familiar with the Europeans. They had met the Dutch, the English, the Portuguese, and the Spanish. They had encountered them for more than 150 years. But the difference with Van Riebeeck is that the native people never believed that the Europeans intended a permanent settlement. They only perceived them as temporary visitors. And the 1647 shipwreck did not change this perception either, as the Dutch did not stay for longer than 5 months at the Cape. So from these early experiences and encounters, the Koikoi simply had no way of knowing that the Dutch intended to settle permanently. A couple of years after the arrival of Van Riebeeck, between 1652 and 1662, there was a brief period of amicable exchanges of cattle between the Dutch and the Koikoi. What the Dutch primarily wanted were people to work for them. They also wanted cattle for meat. The terms of the trade, nevertheless, were still grossly exploitative. Often the Dutch traded tobacco, bracelets, copper beads, and Dutch guilders in exchange for cattle, for sheep, which the Dutch mostly slaughtered for food. But soon the Dutch discovered the value of these animals beyond subsistence and began to sell them to the French and the English ships. In 1656, Van Riebeeck sold cattle at about 25 guilders per head and sheep for about 5 guilders. Guilders was the currency, the Dutch currency. Considering that he paid less than 5 guilders per head of cattle and 1 guilder for sheep, he made profits of close to 400% in the trade. As the demand for meat increased among the Dutch, the Koikoi became reluctant to trade, either because they realized the futility of acquiring bracelets for cattle or because they simply did not have enough cattle. These conditions of trade changed, and the Dutch attitudes towards the Koikoi also changed. These were no longer voluntary exchanges, but they were compulsory exchanges. By the 1680s, the Koikoi were doing all in their power to avoid cattle trading. They would mislead expeditions, they would hide their stock, and when their options ran out, they would sell sheep instead of cattle. But the Dutch traders were relentless in their pursuit for cattle. They had guns, something that the local population did not have. They punished the Koikoi chiefs who refused to trade. The terms of the trade, really a barter, became wholly one-sided, with prices set by the company. An exchange that took place in 1699 captures the trade imbalance. Ambroise Zasse, a trader on behalf of the company, told the Koikoi chief, Ngcukaitobi, that he could not return to the Cape with the few cattle because that the Koikoi had offered. He asked, "What will the governor say?" Ngcukaitobi responded, "The governor will take me to the Cape and set me in the black hole," which was a dungeon. Is that butter? You see, what had happened was that the Dutch had dug a deep trench. Koikoi cattle headers who refused to sell cattle were thrown into the trench and threatened with being buried alive. If they changed their mind and brought the cattle to the company, they survived. Many, however, did not survive. This level of barbarous cruelty was not isolated. It was intrinsic to the structure of the Dutch society and how they related to the black population that they encountered. This violence was not isolated. It was sanctioned by Van Riebeeck himself. Take, for instance, Van Riebeeck's entry in his diary on the 29th of May, 1655. This is what he says: "The natives are shown every friendship and generosity, so that in the event of a suitable occasion arising and the interest of the honorable company requiring it, their cattle and persons can be seized and held in the company's power. This they richly deserve, and every day there are ample opportunities for carrying it out." So the unfair cattle trade and dispossession did not on its own mark the demise of the Koikoi society. Land too was part of the story. By 1657, there were growing numbers of employees of the company. These were known as free beggars or free men, who wanted their freedom from the Dutch East India Company. but they had no land to make a living. The directors of the company, the Council of 17, passed a resolution to give the free men a helping hand wherever necessary so that they can make an early and favorable start and progress. How would this happen? This is what they did. They included freehold in land. They included gifts of enslaved people working for them. They included gifts of plowing tools. Moreover, the freemen were exempt from paying any taxes for a period of 3 years. The land, which had been taken from the Koikoi and given to the freemen by the company, would remain their property forever to do with it as they like. That is, they could sell, they could lease, otherwise they could alienate it as they wished. The company would also guarantee them access to the market, as all the produce would be bought by the company. In exchange, only one condition was imposed on the freemen. The cattle required for plowing and in due course for breeding purposes must be bought from the company. In this way, the company closed off any potential competition for access to Koikoi cattle. With free land, free slave labor, access to the markets, access to capital, access to resources, the company set in motion an agricultural economy at the Cape. This also marked the beginning of the demise of the Khoi society. When the Dutch wars against the Koikoi began, large-scale cattle expropriation was common as tributes or spoils of war. The 1713 smallpox epidemic, usually historians cite this as the key event that led to the demise of Khoi society. But this is not so. That epidemic of 1713 found a people already displaced and wretched. The loss of cattle played a significant part in the rupture and collapse of the Koikoi society. This is then the story of the western part of the Cape. As gruesome as it was only the beginning. To understand South Africa better, the story of the British annexation of the Xhosa land of the Eastern Cape should be factored into the historical equation. This is what I want to do in the next 10 minutes. In the last frontier war of the Eastern Cape in 1878, the Xhosas were thoroughly beaten. Sakhile Kayinza, their king, was a hunted fugitive. Various chiefs such as Sandile, Siolo, and Xoko were imprisoned at Robben Island after sham trials. Thousands were killed, while women and children were driven into exile. But the greatest loss, as John Milton writes in The Edges of War, was the loss of cattle, which amounted in that war alone to 45,000 animals. Yet this was hardly their first experience of such loss. Each frontier war had been marked by cattle ransom, with the surrender of cattle as a suit for peace. In his own autobiography, Harry Smith, writing about the throes of the Sixth Frontier War, referred to a capture of 5,000 head of cattle in one day alone in August 1836, and another 14,000 head of cattle from Macomo's Kraal in that same year. When that war ended, Benjamin Durban, the colonial governor of the Cape, claimed that they had been taken from the Xhosa, besides the conquest and alienation of their country, about 60,000 head of cattle, almost all their goats, their habitations, everywhere else destroyed, and their gardens and cornfields laid to waste. This is an enormous number given by Benjamin Durban, but Jeff Perez argues that it was only a tip of the iceberg in relation to the cattle actually lost. Many cattle were killed by the colonial troops for food. In cases when the Xhosas took their cattle to neutral territory, where there was no war, numberless hundreds, especially calves, died from exposure. Others slipped on the narrow edges of the Amatola mountain and plunged down the steep cliffs. Others were killed by frantic goading, and their headers attempted to hurry them ahead of the advancing soldiers. So the colonial strategy was not just a conquest over land, nor was it limited to political control. It was a strategy of total annihilation of the indigenous people's economic independence and their complete subjugation to white rule. Without cattle, the Xhosa would be dependent on a wage economy. Perez sums up the pitiful sight of the Xhosa after the Sixth Frontier War. Their houses burnt, their crops destroyed, their cattle dead. Many of the Xhosa who succeeded in surviving the war were utterly ruined. The network of mutual aid, which normally carried individuals through bad times, was simply impaired. For most men found their neighbors as destitute as themselves. The taking of Xhosa cattle by the British was not always a byproduct of war. Sometimes it was its project, its object, its intention. Take the example of the Seventh Frontier War of 1846 to 1847, which was fought by the Ngcuka side of the Xhosa during the era of Chief Mkolombane Sandile. The British Army had assembled some Koikoi, Mfengus, and Boer commandos. An instruction given to the British riflemen was to confiscate Xhosa cattle. The Natal Witness of 21 August 1847 exalted the successes of the British in taking a large number of Xhosa cattle in a single day, 17 July 1846. 350 cattle were captured by Captain Melville's company, killing 2 Kafirs. I'm sorry to use the term, it's a K word, but it's truthfulness to the original text. There were more cattle seized, the Boer commandos being at the forefront. The Swellendam beggars distinguished themselves by great gallantry. One Captain Groenewald was praised for the seizure of some 2,000 head of cattle in the face of the enemy. That day alone, 17th of July 1846, ended with the capture of 5,300 head of cattle, with a further loss of enemy of some 40 men, they wrote. By 1857, after the cattle killing catastrophe of Ngcukaitobi, some 13,000 Xhosa men and children were sent to work in the colony as laborers. Although this number was large, it had barely begun to relieve the desire of the colonies for cheap labor. In this climate, with the African people's loss of cattle, food, land, and political authority, their subjugation was further entrenched. The loss of cattle, however, was not limited to the Cape. In the expeditions of the Boers against the Pedi of the Northern Transvaal, a similar story took place. In 1852, the Boers had embarked on a military expedition against the Pedi, using the pretext of disobedience from the Pedi king, Sekwati. Sekwati was accused of having encouraged his subject to reject Boer authority. An attack was launched by Boer commando units led by Hendrik Potgieter and Pieter Nel. Although they failed to force the Pedi into submission, they nevertheless seized some 5,000 cattle and 6,000 small stock and captured children as slaves. The cattle heists continued for the next 30 years. Peter Delia's records that in the period between 1850 and 1876, the Pedi suffered heavy cattle losses. In July 1876, large numbers of cattle were captured. In fact, booty in cattle was one of the main incentives to the operations of the contingents manning the fort. The Boers denied the Pedi access to grazing land, compounding their suffering. As such, the Pedi were forced to exchange cattle for grain. There were reports in February 1877 of starving children and women, as well as cattle that had been kept on the mountains with no access to grazing fields. Witnesses also saw some 300 to 400 hides stacked at the capital, which gives some indication of the extent of cattle loss. The story of Zululand mirrors the story of Transvaal and the Cape. Thousands of Zulu cattle were lost, first to Boers and then to the British. The basic history is that the founder of the Zulu kingdom, Shag, was assassinated in 1828. Dingane became the king. Dingane himself was assassinated in 1840, 2 years after the arrival of the Voortrekkers in Natal. When Dingane was killed, Mbande had acted in cahoots with the Boers. So the Voortrekkers demanded 40,000 cattle in the debacle surrounding the death of Dingane as a tribute to their role in his assassination. As early as October 1839, the Boers had struck a deal with Mbande upon a combined attack on Dingane, his overthrow and the establishment of Mbande as king. After the assassination of Dingane, Mbande refused the Boers' demand for cattle, apparently not recognizing an earlier promise to them by Dingane. The Boers, however, would not take no for an answer. Since war was a possibility, Mbande finally promised to obey their rule. Andres Pretorius, one of the Boer heroes of the era, he was a leader of one of the commandos, seized some 31,000 head of cattle, leaving Mbande the vassal king of an impoverished and diminished kingdom, bleeding from the unhealed wounds of civil war. When the 1913 Native Land Act was passed, often people blame that act for heralding dispossession of land. One of the attorneys I wrote about in The Land is Ours, Richard Msimang, denied this impact of the Native Land Act. He considered it a mistake to confine our understanding of the Native Land Act and its effects to land only. For him, in a paper he wrote in 1918, the true effects of the Native Land Act were the losses of tenure and property, particularly cattle. Yet the stories that he recorded illustrated not just a loss, but a wholesale confiscation of a mode of living. With the land available to Africans having been reduced, the number of cattle that they could keep also had to be reduced. Often sham transactions were concluded, with Africans expected to sell their cattle in exchange for a place to stay. Farming tools were also exchanged, and perhaps most valuably, labor was sold in exchange for accommodation. I must now talk about the final phase of the cattle loss in the last 10 minutes of my talk. One of the features of the Glen Grey Act of 1894 for the Cape Colony was individual tenure, with the government allocating surveyed plots of land to Africans in the native reserves without granting them full title. This became known as the Cecil John Rhodes strategy of one man, one plot. It is in this climate that my grandmother was born. But the plots were too small and could not provide enough food for proper subsistence. Inevitably, these reserves became sources of cheap labor, as the people could not live off the land. Another problem was the creation of a landless class that expanded because individual allotments were uneconomical. With larger numbers of people occupying the land, the soil was eroded, overgrazed, and its quality destroyed. In 1932, the government's Native Economic Commission reported on the native economic problem. This is how they put it. Our problem is therefore not only as it is in agriculture to teach the native how to use their land more economically, but it is also a race against time to prevent the destruction of large grazing areas, the erosion and denudation of the soil, and the drying up of springs. The proposed solution, perhaps not surprisingly, was not the provision of additional land to Africans. Under the Native Trust and Land Act of 1936, the government's idea, instead, was the limitation upon the number of stock, cattle, carried by native population in the native areas. In effect, the government was blaming Africans for using poor farming methods, being unable to maintain their stock and overgrazing the land. It soon found a solution, cattle culling. This would be proclaimed in 1939 as a so-called betterment or rehabilitation scheme. Its stated intention was to improve the agricultural condition of the reserves, including the production of better quality cattle. Of course, this was a ruse. In his unpublished memoir, W.M. Tsotsi, an attorney in the former Transkei and president of the All Africa Convention, wrote about this in 1958, and he pointed with precision to the problem. The African reserves or homelands are grossly overstocked. The basic cause of overstocking is overpopulation. The only reasonable solution is a radical redistribution of the land as between black and white farmers. However, no white government is prepared to embark on such a program, since it would mean taking land as presently owned by whites for occupation by blacks. Within a year of the National Party coming into office in 1949, it passed another proclamation. The intention of this proclamation was to limit, to control, and to improve livestock, but it only applied in the Bantu areas and not in the white areas. This law, which did not go via parliament, was passed by the Governor General, the Supreme Chief of all Africans. This was a devastating law. In 1949, that proclamation gave the Minister of Bantu Affairs, previously the Minister of Native Affairs, the power to declare any land to be a betterment area, provided it is in a Bantu area. In these areas, Bantu Affairs commissioners could assess the number of cattle units that could be kept. A cattle unit was defined as 1 head of a large stock or 5 head of small stock. In other words, 1 cow or 5 cows or 5 sheep. After this assessment, the commissioner was required to ensure that the cattle were counted. Cattle owners would be instructed to bring their cattle for tallying, the failure of which was an offense which could lead to criminal imprisonment. If the cattle were in excess of the stipulated number, often imposed arbitrarily, they could be culled or removed from the betterment area. If a person ordered to slaughter or remove a cow failed to do so, a commissioner could impound that animal and remove it from the area. The commissioner's powers were so vast that they included the authority to have any bull castrated that he deemed too old or of too low quality for breeding purposes. In practice, large scores of African cattle were removed or slaughtered. The government's decision on the capacity levels of the betterment areas were often arbitrary and taken without consultation. Strife was inevitable. One of the areas where a conflict happened was in Witseshoek in 1944, which ultimately led to a conflict in 1950. Another area where there was a conflict is in the former Transkei. This is recorded in the book, The Peasants' Revolt by Governor Mbeki, who draws connections between the government's cattle culling strategies and the imposition of Bantu authorities across the country. The latter resulted in a rebellion in Pondoland in 1960, which was also crushed by the government. It is not possible to estimate the number of cattle lost by Africans under the so-called betterment schemes, but it can be asserted that these programs, which I have described as the third wave of cattle dispossession, deepened the proletarianization of African people living in the reserves. They could not support themselves on the available land and were compelled to seek wages in industrial centers such as Johannesburg. If one bears in mind the centrality of cattle to the African economy and culture, it is clear that the loss of cattle, together with the land, contributed substantially to the disintegration of African polities. It is not possible today to speak of the return of the cattle lost during the colonial conquest and apartheid, but it is at least possible to widen the scope of the debate as to what was lost during settler occupation. And for me personally, I can finally give an answer to my grandmother's dilemma. I now know what she meant when she referred to the law. It is the law, my son, she would say, as the cause of her own dispossession. And as a country, we can give a new, perhaps hopefully better, historical appreciation of the concept of looting. And finally, most of the cattle I have been talking about are no longer traceable as cows or bulls or calves. Their value has transmogrified into bonds, into cash, into stock, into real wealth. You see, cattle were once cash. They were forms of trade. Unlike land, they could be privately owned. They were forms of establishing relationships with the dead. They were forms of establishing relationships with strangers, of maintaining existing relationships with friends. Their loss was a loss of an economy. When we speak of the return of the land, we should be speaking in the broader terms about the return of the economy. Often when Blacks make this point, they are stigmatized. They are asked, what is wrong with you people? Why don't you go and get some education, get a job, make something of your life? But I think responses like this downplay the impact, not just of what was lost, but the continuing impact of racial injustice. In this paper, I've tried to consolidate the losses, but this is an attempt at consolidating losses of more than 400 years. But these are not losses that are stuck in the past, stuck at a point in history. They are continuing losses. If there is anything to take from this talk today, it is the continuing need for racial justice. Legal equality in the abstract is no longer a satisfactory answer. What we need is racial justice. Needing racial justice does not mean abandoning the law. We need racial justice under the law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tembeka, for such a fantastic delivery of your thoughts around the nexus between land, the economic malaise, and just the political restructuring and the legal restructuring that is necessary in South Africa, and also, of course, the importance of looking at history and the role that history has played, our history, and also particular kinds of histories. Because as you began the talk, you shared about the history lessons that you were subjected to, and how they tell a particular story, and that story overwhelmingly, many South Africans referred that story. And it has gone somewhat unchallenged within like pedagogical circles, and even now in the structuring of what our history looks like, I'm not sure. I think I'm not sure it adequately does justice to the complexity of where we are today, and certainly, as you have said, this accumulative loss, and there's just the vastness, the sheer magnanimity of the economic, social, and the political life, and how all of that has constructed our present. So I'm certain that there are some questions, and I'm going to draw on Matthew, who's one of our PhD, our doctoral candidates in our department, to just help me out in filtering out the questions that may pop up on the chat. I see here that my colleague Stephen Robbins has a comment here. He says, thanks very much for an excellent talk, a really important history of dispossession that goes beyond conventional historical accounts. I completely concur. And you know, I've bought your book. it's on my list. It's on my bookshelf. I will tuck in, certainly. So friends, colleagues, within this virtual room, do you have any questions that you want to ask our guest today? You can do so by just raising your hand, and that's in that the icon on the top of your screen, the little yellow hand, if that's possible. Anybody? Or yes, I see that. Excuse me if I don't say your names properly, or I just am referring to you by first names. Ishmael, I see your hand is up. Go ahead, please. What we'll do is we'll take maybe about three questions, and then if that's all right, and then we can go ahead.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Personally, I have read the two books of Advocate Tembeka and Ngcukaitobi, and what I take from the two books is that cattle dispossession was a symbol of wealth within Black people. So will I be illogically stretching the ambit of compensation if I would say that cattle dispossession must be included in the debate of restitution? What is the contemporary solution to that? Because if we are to address the real problem, we cannot only talk about land, but then what about the stolen cattle? Thank you. Thank you. That's my question.
Sorry, thanks very much, Ishmael. We'll just take two more questions. I see there that Ngobi Ngubane has a question.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for the talk. Livestock is indeed an important commodity in the history of South Africa. And what is fascinating for me in the current moment, when you look at land reform farms that have been recently redistributed, the minority of the land that has been redistributed, we are seeing increasing numbers of livestock and cattle in particular throughout the Free State province and in some part of KwaZulu-Natal and some part of Eastern Cape, where there are resuscitations of livestock and particularly cattle. And where I'm going with this is to land reform farms that have been restituted to labor tenants in particular, who have had historical restrictions to cattle head numbers they could keep. But with the dismantling of private property, when the land is returned to them, we are seeing increasing cattle numbers, which is a positive trend in the country, which hints to the fact that if more land could be redistributed, we could even see more positive trends with rising cattle numbers. And probably you are familiar with the Office of the Special Master, Labor Tenants. It's currently collecting similar history with regards to labor tenants, and I think there's some important dynamics that could be followed up in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you. We have just one last question here on the chat. It's from Purity Ngumane. It says, thank you for a very insightful discussion. Can I please understand the reason behind 11 cattle lobola by Sir Theophilus, as it imposed and doesn't really have direct effects on colonizers? Great. So there are some other questions coming through, but we'll park those for the next round. The floor is yours, Tembeka, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, you know, Ishmael's point, it's something I wrestled with myself because it became clear in my own research that the land dispossession is an incomplete thesis, because if you went to a black village in say 1652, which is when Van Riebeeck arrived, and you asked the people there what their most important asset were, they would not say it was land, because their conception of land was that land was incapable of ownership and possession on an individual level. It was for us to inherit, to make use of, but to pass on. But the one asset they would have fought very hard about were cattle, because cattle could be individually owned, could be owned by men or women. And so if cattle were the real symbol of wealth, you know, how do we factor them into the equation of restitution? Because we've marginalized the cattle discussion in the equation of restitution. Now that's where I think it becomes important to talk in an expansive way about the return of the economy, that actually the real economy were cattle. And if the real economy were cattle, we should be having a broader discussion, which is about reparations. That for me is an important part of the conversation. Is what we need is a reparative, future-looking project, because it was by the taking of the cattle that the black economy was destroyed. I've been unable to quantify the losses, but there were many. I mean, I could get to 1 million just for the Eastern Cape alone, only before 1913, you know. But I realized then that it's a moving target. The numbers are astronomical. And if you also think about the multiplier effect, you know, a cow is not just one cow. You know, each cow will probably give birth 7 or 8 times in its life. Now, if it gives birth to a female cow, even that cow will give birth to 7 or 8 times. So if you apply the multiplier when it comes to cattle, these are enormous numbers. And if you actually think of the ways in which take, for instance, someone like Smith. You know, Smith went to Xhosaland. In one encounter, he took 14,000 cattle from one family. So he took 14,000 cattle. Of course, it was a chief, a Makoma. But he took in one day 14,000 cattle from Makoma's kraal. How many cattle did Makoma actually have? So if you actually think about the scale of the wealth that was captured in these cattle and the disruption of that economy by the sheer looting that took place, then you have a scenario in which the destruction caused by colonial conquest is an impossible one to quantify. So what can we do about it? I think at the very least, we can factor in cattle dispossession in the frame of restitution, which at the moment we haven't done. So that's the only contribution I can make on that score. And then there is the point by Ngubane. I mean, I think it's a promising start if the labor tenants are receiving cattle as part and parcel of their settlement. That is a promising start. But we must remember the laws that came after 1894. When I grew up, in the villages of the Transkei, the one thing that always struck me, our village was surrounded by white farms. But in each of our villages, there was like I think it was a morgan, it's like one family had a morgan, we thought that was a lot of land. But every time you looked across the river and you saw where the white farmers owned, I mean, it almost looked like their, morgans were unlimited, like there is no way you can limit the number of land, If you go there maybe to buy a goat or something, you just can't see where the farm ends, But when you look at how this thing happened, there was just a law, passed by Cecil John Rhodes, one man, one plot. And you look at why did he pass it? I mean, you see in his own input in 1893 to Parliament, when he says that we actually have a lot of natives who are lazy. And the only way to make them economically active is to reduce the land they have, because for as long as they are independently sustaining themselves by cattle farming, we won't have the labor that we need in the mines. And that is explicit. I mean, it strikes you when you read it today that actually that was the deliberate strategy, that if you want able-bodied men, just take them out of the villages and impose a tax, the hard tax, So if you look at, this is how the labor tenant system was constructed, So where the lot of labor was needed in the farms and it was needed in the mines, And where was it? It was in the villages. And how was this done? Just impose tax and restrict the hectares that could be owned and take away the cattle. Just impose a law that says you're not allowed to own more than 5 cattle. That's the law. So it's a promising thing that the resettlement, I don't know that policy, it's the first time I've heard about it, that the resettlement now factors in cattle. But it's an impossible thing to do because, for labor tenants, a labor tenant is only entitled to that extent of the land that they used during the labor tenancy. That's what you get. And often that was based on the Cecil Rhodes idea of one man, one plot. So you couldn't have more than 5 cattle on that plot, as a labor tenant. So it doesn't have to give you cattle if they don't expand the land that you have. So you will still have a plot, and you will still not be able to graze more than 5 cattle, at a given time. So you are always back to where you started, which is the only way the problem can be sorted is by allocating more land, and then changing, the tenure system. Our obsession with private tenure, which is something else I deal with in this book, is part of the problem. And then the last point about Theophilus Shepstone. I mean, I have critiqued Theophilus Shepstone. He is an interesting fellow. His own family is interesting because they can be traced directly to, if you look at the Shepstone family, they can be traced directly to the first group of the 1820 settlers. And Shepton had many sons. I think he had about 4 sons. But they all ultimately became part of the colonial civil service. And the most, quote unquote, distinguished was Theophilus. And what distinguished Theophilus, I mean, he had experience in Xhosaland, where he served as interpreter and a diplomatic agent of native tribes. And when he went to Zululand, he sort of went around saying, well, I actually know natives, so, trust me. So when he imposed these laws, like, 11 cattle, and that 11 cattle has now become part and parcel of custom, like we say, that's our own custom. But everyone has forgotten that actually this is, 1860s, and that's, Theophilus Shepton, and it was thumb-sucking. He just thumb-sucked the number, and he said, that's it. But it was a way of regulating the exchanges, of cattle among native people. They didn't have enough land. You can't allow them to have 30. That's too many. But 11 is manageable. But Shepton didn't need to have any reason to invent custom. Shepton just invented custom as he went along. What for me is interesting is how in this so-called post-colonial era, we still live with the rules constructed by Shepton, but they have acquired a new legitimacy because they are all part and parcel of our custom. What we haven't done is to interrogate the sources of this custom as to whether or not they have any historical basis in custom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a couple more. We have a hand and then another question in the chat, and a comment as well. So it's another round of 3. So there's a question here from Vuisile Moyo, who's a PhD student with the Sociology department. And his question says, my question is on migration of some of the South African tribes that migrated north to settle in what was then called Northern Rhodesia. Can one assume that the cattle looting and downsizing of land was one of the reasons that led to these people migrating northwards? That's his question. Then there's a comment from Stephen Robbins, professor in our department of anthropology. The nexus between the economic, cultural, and social loss from these forms of cattle dispossession is something that most historical accounts have not addressed. This is a major contribution to addressing this gap. This is the less told story of the production of free labor, and that's done in inverted comma, for capitalist development in South Africa. If I do have time a bit later in the session, I have a question that's sort of in tangent to what Robbins has said here. Then we have a question from, this is the second question, from Joshua Chiburie. It says, what is your perception of African collaborators with various British colonial administrations and Boer republics? What comes to mind are the Mfengu people who played a key role in cementing colonial rule in the Cape Colony. Do you think that they should be entitled to land or cattle restitution? Pardon me. Oh wow, the questions are coming in very fast. Okay, so we'll just tackle those 2, and then we actually possibly, depending on how much time we have left, we have about 3 or 4 more questions after that. If I can ask those who are wanting to ask questions, if you can just jot them down in the chat, and we can portion our time correctly. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is a fascinating point, this point about collaboration. In the book, I do touch upon some of the cattle tributes that were as a result of collaboration. So the story is not one size fits all. The whites are taking the cattle of blacks. What punctures the story is sometimes that some blacks are collaborating with the whites to pursue a colonial object. But one needs to be very skeptical of those accounts. I've spent a lot of my time in archives to be very skeptical of the accounts by whites that seek to explain the story of collaboration. Because every time I've looked at collaboration, I ultimately end up being sympathetic with the collaborator. Because often, so if you take, for instance, let's say, what's the war? Say 1819. So you've got the Ngcukaitobi and the Ndlambe. It's the old story between the two big Xhosa nations fighting among themselves. To take those stories, what you always find is that one side of the debate wants the whites to support them so that they could, conquer. But that collaboration is itself a manifestation of subservience to a colonial authority. So that's why, every time I've explored these stories, I've come ultimately to the side of the so-called collaborator. And even if you look at the Van Riebeeck diary, which I spent more time reading for this book than I did with the first one, even if you look at the Van Riebeeck diaries, when Van Riebeeck, talks about the ways in which they created conflict among the different Koikoi groups, it usually starts off by terror, like sheer terror. So what you've got terrified people who are then told that we need to send you on an expedition, on a cattle expedition. And then over time, those people start, quote unquote, collaborating, with the Dutch, and they become the people they send to war. They become the people they send to dispossess others, But it's about survival, It's about survival. They themselves are trying to survive, And so your point is a specific one, which is what to do about the Mvengus. There is complexity about the Mvengus. I've looked at their story I was writing a paper now, about 4 months ago, writing a paper on the trial of Enoch Mgijima, which was a 1921 trial arising from the Bulhoek massacre. And for those who don't know, Mgijima's people, were part and parcel of the Mvengu people. It's fascinating to see that although they initially formed a buffer between the Xhosas and the British during the era of Smith in the 1830s, and they were used by the British to engage in, expeditions against the Xhosas, whether these were cattle expeditions or whether these were war, etc. But they were always used as a buffer between themselves and the British. If you fast forward to 1921, at the time of the massacre, and you re-examine the position of the Mvengus, at that stage, one of the most interesting aspects of that story is that the Mvengus were no longer a special people, in other words, the Black Englishmen. They were just known as natives under the Native Land Act. And in fact, it's one of the reasons that contributed to that conflict. It's the loss of that special status that they once enjoyed. So the problem is that these historical stories also over time shift and change in importance. There was a point when Smith, preferred to have a relationship with the Mvengus. And then at a later stage, the British completely shift their approach, and they'd rather have a relationship with colored people, or they would rather have a relationship with Afrikaners. And so that's why don't think that it's fair to talk of the Mfengus and their role in history as stuck in a particular paradigm that is an unchanging paradigm. We've got to recognize the historical paradigm as an evolving paradigm. And at one point, you are a collaborator, and at another point, you are engaged in war with the party you collaborated with in the past. And most stories of collaboration are stories of survival. And hence, in my own reading of these stories of collaboration, I've ultimately always become sympathetic with the collaborators. Once you looked at why, and once you looked at the aftermath, because in this country, this ultimate story became you were either native or European. At some point in time, you just became native or European. And any collaboration that contributed to the establishment of your society in the 1830s was totally forgotten by the 1920s. And the Mgijima part of the story fascinates me from that point of view. So yes, the answer is they should also benefit from cattle restitution. They should also benefit from land restitution, because at a certain point in time in history, they just became native and became the subject to the brutality of native laws. Yeah, I don't know the answer to this point about, I've not looked at this point that I think Moyo is raising about northward migration, whether or not the dispossession of cattle contributed to it. I don't know the answer. I have to look at it. I've looked specifically at the Western Cape, the Eastern Cape, Zululand, and the Transvaal as sites of cattle dispossession by both the Dutch in their original form and later as Boers, and the British. The British just never sort of changed. They maintained the same ethnicity as the ethnicity of the Dutch transformed over time. I mean, they'll deny it, they'll say it's all original, but it's been a changing ethnicity. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. There's so many questions, which is, of course, wonderful. And we have about 4 more. I think this will be the final round of questions. So we'll take we will take these 4, and then we will close for the afternoon. The first question comes from Lisa Applegren. She says, taking into account the fact that natives were arbitrarily dispossessed of wealth, how does one envisage the law being used to redistribute wealth? I'm assuming whatever law is enacted cannot be as arbitrary as those that were used to dispossess natives in the first place. And then I'm going to skip that one, the next question, and see if we have time later. That's from Professor Robbins again. And go on to Carol Sitole. Says, in your closing, you mentioned cattle was a symbol of exchange, and those have been replaced by capital markets like bonds, equities, etc. I work in the capital markets industry. Over the years, I've seen the reluctance of South African companies to truly transform. We know that the BEE codes have been disastrous in dealing with transformation. What policies do you suggest would be effective in closing the gap in transformation? Should we put pressure on the exchanges, i.e. JSE, to review their legislation to impose disclosures on listed companies on transformation and sustainability? So that's Carol Sitole's question. And then we have something like a penultimate question from Insiki Makay. Says, please can you elaborate on the ownership of land by women that you touch on in Land Matters and colonial imposed laws that are now perceived as African culture? And it looks like actually it was the penultimate question, because it looks like the final comment there is a comment. So this is another question from Xolani Ngosi. This is probably a simplistic question. Do you really think our ancestors valued cattle the same way back then as we do today? And then just a comment from Tembeka and Ntombela. The Natives Land Act restricted Black people from buying or occupying land. Cattle were looted to ensure they no longer were able to provide for their families. Oh, sorry, there's a question, pardon me. What laws speak to rectifying this unjust looting of cattle act? And that is the final question. That was it. Yes.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, that's a good question, the last one. Yes, there is no law that talks about the repossession of unjustly looted cattle. I think that's part of the problem, because I think the politicians have focused too much on we need the land to come back. Even that's not happening. But the problem is that the cattle were the economy, and there is just no law that talks about the restoration of this economy. So what we have are nebulous things like the BE Act, etc. But what we don't have a full-scale restorative, economic restorative project. Whether one calls it reparations or not, but the fact is we just do not have any law that is intended or designed to restore these losses of cows. But if I'm right in my theory that the cows were the African economy, then where are we going to get the restoration from? And then that's why I talk about this idea of stigma. Every time as a Black person you say, we have not had reparations. The answer you get is go to school and get education, go and work, stop asking the government to do everything for you. But there is no society that has grown from the ashes of the extent of the dispossession that we have sustained as a country and as a people for over 400 years, that can suddenly be expected, to sort itself out. In land matters, I've spent a lot of time looking at the Jewish question and also being very sympathetic with Jewish people, and trying to understand how they reconstructed their society after the tragedy of the Holocaust, And everywhere you go, it's just impossible to think of what kind of a society is just going to rebuild itself without tangible asset base, redistributed. So if you can't have, an economy that's just is supposed to grow in the air, without proper redistributive economics. It's just impossible to see how this will happen. So yes, today we are talking about cattle, but cattle are a symbol of something larger, something intangible. They're a symbol of economic looting. That economic looting took place over 400 years. The question I try to interrogate is, what is the extent to which current laws perpetuate the economic looting as opposed to disrupting it? Because on the one hand, I'm a believer in constitutionalism, but constitutionalism only makes sense if it is disruptive of the status quo, which is characteristic and in fact entrenches, right, this economic looting, which for today's lecture are focused on cattle looting. So that's why I think this is Ntombela's question. It's a brilliant one, which is, what is the law that talks about the restoration of this looting? We don't have it. We need it. Xolani, I think it's I think we underestimate just how important the cattle were. I mean, there are many codes that are found, codes of the colonies. I mean, the one sort of historical scene I like looking at is when the Europeans arrived, most of them, you know, whether they were teachers or they were proper colonists or whether they were soldiers but they always carried diaries, you know, they wrote down their impressions of native people. It's the most fascinating thing to actually read those accounts. The one thing that is common among those European accounts of native people is how much devoted native people were to their cattle. You know, the shape of the horns, you know, the horns could have like whatever, 50 different type of shapes, but each shape, you know, had a description, a native description, a Xhosa or a Zulu or a Sotho or a Pedi description, you know, it had a name for it. The colors of the cattle, the shades, different shades of the cattle. The fact that, I mean, you know, a friend of mine sent me this, you might be interested, sent me this today. So this is what it reads. It says, Mbalu, whose tribe bore the brunt of the land dispossession when Governor Plettenberg used Ngcuba, which Ngcuba is Fish River for those who don't know, as a border between the British colony and Kaffrland, were known as Amambalu, from Inkosi Langa's favorite ox. Maqoma's favorite cattle was known as Ngamabala. Thus, the tribe he established, so those who have read about Maqoma, they know that he is sometimes called Ijing, you know, and his own people are called Amajing. Where did that come from? It came from his favorite cow. See? Mlawu's favorite ox called Ngcukaitobi, and as such, Amangcuka were actually known as Amangcangathelo. Kona's favorite ox was named Ngcueleshe. As such, his people were known as Amangcueleshe. You know, so this came from a friend of mine who researches in the same area, Push Ntabeni. So not only did the Europeans record the devotion of natives to cattle, you can see this in many, many symbols, social symbols, cultural symbols, political symbols of native people, and the extent to which they related to their cattle. So it seemed their cattle defined their entire world. You know, most of us, those who are raised by grandparents in the villages, whether it is the villages of Zululand or, we know the importance of cattle. We know that if you have to go to university, they must sell a cow, right? We know that for a source of calcium, you must milk a cow. We know that sometimes for a traditional event, a cow must be slaughtered. We know that if a cow cries, it is a good symbol because it illustrates this consensus with the ancestors. So it's a connection between the spiritual world and the world we inhabit. We know that it also establishes relationships with strangers. If you want to lobola, you send cattle because they are a mechanism of establishing a relationship with a total stranger. So we underestimate the extent to which on a cultural, on a social, on a political, on an economic, and even political relations were established by cattle. A new society that wants to show its allegiance to a big king would send a tribute, 2,000 cattle as a tribute. We just want to send you these cattle because we want to appreciate and show our allegiance to your kingdom. So it's a central part of African existence and African lives. And so disrupting that is a very traumatic thing. It's just a trauma of that disruption of something that you held so sacred. You know, so that's the point I'm trying to make about this cattle, is that it's that disruption of something so sacred and something so central to your life, like suddenly realizing that actually God does not exist, and yet you are raised to be a Christian. Suddenly realizing that Jesus is just a figment, And so the trauma of that is an impossible trauma to describe. Yes, I would like one day to talk about the issue of ownership of land by women. I have a chapter in the book that deals with that. I think the only thing, it's also just to disrupt these narratives that by custom, women were not allowed to own land or to control land. I show in the book various instances, even during the colonial conquest, in which women had real control over land. But I also show that on a contemporary basis, women are not waiting for men to empower them. They are actually working the land in the villages, and they are embarking upon their own self-sustaining strategies. And often they are supporting their men who are sitting in the mines, And so just that today was not the day for this. I would have loved to speak more about that issue. Yes, Carol Sithole, I agree with the point that in this country, there is reluctance by companies to transform. And it is clear that laws like Black economic empowerment are insufficient to guarantee socio-economic, thoroughgoing transformation. And it's clear that sometimes the Constitution is frustrated, its transformative ethos is frustrated by the private sector. But none of those actually mean we should abandon the law. We still need the law, because when we do not have the law, often the people who benefit are the people with guns and money, and the people who lose out are poor people. So that's one of the things I'm trying to think about is, it's clear that so far, after 27 years of trial and error, the people who have largely benefited from our economy are white people. One of the stats I show in my book is that on land reform alone, since 1994, we've spent 60 billion rands. More than 60% of that 60 billion rands has gone to white farmers. And actually very little has filtered down to land claimants, Black land claimants. So even an idea like land reform continues to benefit white farmers. It's as astonishing as that, the extent to which basically freedom has just been captured. Then Ulisa, how should we use the law? I think this is true. We should think creatively about the Constitution and how it should be used to leverage transformation. At the moment, there's a lot of constitutional talk, but I sometimes fear, if you go to the Constitutional Court and you find sort of transformation cases, you find AfriForum defending language, Afrikaans, or opposing affirmative action. All of this is the Constitution, but it's used in a way that restricts rather than facilitates transformation. And part of what I try to do with some of the time I have is to use or to think about using the law in ways that facilitate and advance causes of poor people. At the very least, I try to generate a discussion about the incomplete project of transformation and the real possible failure of the revolution. I think we are at such a critical juncture in the country that there is a real risk that ours will be a failed revolution. Thank you.
Once again, thank you very, very much for joining us today and delivering such an insightful and important lecture. That we now have an archive. We have an archive of this knowledge. We have an archive of these questions and the debates that ensued. I myself have a few questions, and I could chat about this until the cows came home. But we have run out of time, and I hope we can invite you back at a later stage to elaborate on some of the ideas that we didn't have the scope and the breadth to do so here. Yeah, so just on behalf of my Department of Sociology and Anthropology, I want to thank you very, very much. And I look forward to further conversations. And yes, thank you for those that joined us today. And yeah, let's see you at the next indexing transformation. So thank you once again, Tembeka and Ngcukaitobi, for your time, and let's chat again later.
Thank you.